Hello and welcome to Peace Presbyterian Kerks, Peace Presbyterian Church's Sunday school class for adults on titled Heaven, the Christian Hope. My name is Todd Blonshine. I'm one of the teachers along with Joe Frazier. This is the spring 2020 class, lesson 5, and we're really glad to have you with us today.
Well, hey, this is what I look like on the couch at home, and glad you could join me today. I wanted to kind of start off by discussing some of the implications about this Sunday school that are probably being felt if you've listened to the first 4 lessons, and you may not be understanding what's really happening. I certainly have felt the disconnect with my previous understanding of what heaven is. So, in order to do that, we're going to have to delve into the language. Believe it or not, this will actually have the effect of helping you understand the disconnect, so to speak, between our modern way of thinking and the way the biblical writers thought. So stay with me for a little bit. I'll be right back with you. So in lesson 1, we actually covered this topic that the Old Testament, mostly written in Hebrew, contained a single word called Shemayan, which was used for heavens, for the sky, for the atmosphere. There was no differentiation between the physical atmosphere that birds flew in or the abode of God. That was all the same word. The same is true in the New Testament, in the Greek. The word aranon or aranos or any number of aranas is used to implicate both heaven, the visible heavens, as the definition puts it here, as well as the unseen spiritual heavens. And so this deliberately vague wording here leads us to conclude that the biblical writers did not differentiate between the spiritual place that God dwelled in and the physical sky, atmosphere, universe that was above our heads, which is very interesting. And in fact, as the concepts have developed, uh, the chief point that most of these lessons have made is that at one point there was no difference. In other words, that there was a continuum between heaven, the abode of God, the sky, and the earth. It was one continuous physical experience. Now, that said, we can't imagine it because we have never experienced it. Um, but it's actually gotten worse for us because now we live in a modern age, an age in which we send satellites out into space and we've sent men to the moon. And we have gone well beyond our clouds, which the biblical writers never did. So we have many words that describe, technically speaking, things like the sky and our airspace and uh, outer space and the solar system and galaxies, etc., etc. These words are very specific and they're technical. And what has happened as a result is that in modern language, in the last 100+ years, in the modern era, we've divorced in our minds the concept of God's dwelling place from space. So this language has done something that Satan has been wanting to do for a long time, and that is essentially separate the concept of God's lordship over all things, over the heavens and the earth. The scriptures speak many times of God being Lord of all the heavens and the earth, and that his glory will fill the heavens and the earth. And this is a continuum. And so the biblical concept is one of a reconnection, a reestablishment, a regeneration, a resurrection of this combining of things that were separated and lost a long time ago. There's a lot of references to this. Matter of fact, one of the interesting things about the temples that were built, particularly the Temple of Solomon, was that there was great description of the ornateness of it. And what was it decorated with? It was decorated with garden stuff. There were pomegranates and palm trees, and they made lamps that were shaped like flowers, and it was basically depicting in artistic form the beauty of the garden. And so it's it's saying that the temple of God, which is the connection between heaven and earth, right, is this thing which basically is going to reestablish paradise and make that connection complete. Paradise has within it a natural connection to the abode of God. God is the sustainer, the creator of it. In our postmodern world, we live in a world in which, in our lifetimes, we have seen people go to the moon. And that is incredible. The moon is over 200,000 miles away from the Earth. It's just amazing a feat that we could get there. But it has led us to the belief that we are somehow in charge, that we are gods. And in fact, when the first cosmonaut went up, I don't know if you remember Khrushchev's comment was that when the first man entered the outer atmosphere and went around the world in outer space, he said he went up there and he did not see God. And so what Satan has been trying to do for millennia, he has essentially accomplished through language. We live in a scientifically technical language era. And so we have many names for the things that we used to have in the Greek and the Hebrew back in the ancient days, a single word for, because it was a single concept. And now we can describe layers of the heavens. We can describe bits and parts of the heavens that we never described before. So anyway, this will probably help explain the disconnect that some of you probably are feeling. I know I have felt it. And hopefully can get us into the belief that, in fact, the purpose of God in the redemption of mankind is actually the restoration of the reconnection of the unseen heavens to the seen heavens and the seen earth.
In our study, we're actually breaking the Bible down into four parts. The first is the original creation perfection. That was the Garden of Eden and its connection to heaven. We've discussed that. Then the fall of man occurs, the separation between heaven and earth occurs, and earth begins its downward spiral into decay. And that is represented in Genesis chapters 3 all the way through the Old Testament, the book of Malachi. And then we've now entered into the regeneration phase where Jesus enters the scene. And we've begun to talk about how we start to see how heaven and earth will be reconnected. And this is depicted in Matthew and all the Gospels, in fact, and all the letters, all the way up through Revelation 20, which is the last book of the Bible, but not the last chapter. And then in the last two chapters, and this is very symmetrical here, you'll see, the new heavens and the new earth are revealed in the book of Revelation, and they are a connected, perfect union again. So basically the Bible starts off talking about perfection and what it looked like originally. Then it talks about what happened to us and how we got separated from that and what the outcome of that was. And then it talks about Jesus entering into our lives, regenerating us, regenerating the earth, and ultimately ends with a picture of what the future heaven and earth will look like. In the Gospels, we see the life of Jesus and his impact in the regeneration process. Of course, he is the reason regeneration occurs. Last week, we spoke about Jesus' birth, the invasion of earth by heaven in all the different ways that it occurred. And this week, we're going to talk about Jesus' ministry and the glimpses of heaven. We're not going to talk about all of them because basically his whole ministry was glimpses of heaven. But we will talk about one significant aspect of it that I think you'll enjoy today. And then next week, we'll delve into the kingdom of heaven is like. There were a lot of those statements that Jesus made. And then, of course, his death and resurrection and what that means to us and also to our understanding of what heaven is like. So the subject of today's lesson is mostly about the wedding at Cana. This is the first miracle that Jesus ever performed, and we're going to read about it in John 2. And then we're going to talk about its significance with relevance to heaven and these other aspects, future feasts, the wedding feast of the Lamb depicted in Revelation, and the fact that Jesus actually eats with his disciples after the resurrection. So in John 2, now this is chapter 2 of John, we see this first miracle. And it's very interesting that if you really study it, what the first thing you'll notice is that in chapter 1, the very end of chapter 1, Jesus makes this comment. He says, this leads into chapter 2, truly I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. And that's what leads into chapter 2, verses 1, which is what this starts here. So this wedding at Cana, very interestingly, is the beginning of seeing heaven opened. Very, very interesting, isn't it? So let's read it, and I'm going to just comment as we go through. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Okay, third day. For Christians, that's significant because Jesus was raised on the third day. But this third day is talking about probably the third day of when John, who had just been called by Jesus in chapter 1 of John, and the other disciples were walking around with him. That's what you did as a disciple back then. You basically went to school by hanging out with the master, so to speak. So this is the third day. This is the third day he's hanging out with him. So Jesus comes on the scene very quickly in John's life, and only on the third day he gets to experience this. Now, apparently, Jesus' mom was invited. This is the hometown. This is Galilee, remember? And what's the significance of Cana? Well, really, probably not much. To be honest, it's sort of maybe the significance of Cary, North Carolina. Not a big town, not very important. In this wedding, they don't even mention who was actually getting married. This was just a typical small town wedding. All right, verse 2. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. Okay. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." All right. Now, many of you are married. Many of you most of you probably have attended weddings. I have had the privilege of actually throwing two weddings for two beautiful daughters, and also being significantly involved with two weddings for two wonderful sons. Every bride and most grooms, I wouldn't say the grooms necessarily care as much as the brides do, and the brides' moms do, want the wedding to be perfect. It is unbelievable the amount of planning that goes into it. I mean, seating charts and flower choices and cake selection and food selection and beverage selection and venue selection and gown selection. I mean, it keeps going and going and going. And to be candid from a perspective of a guy, it seems a bit much. However, it is kind of an ultimate dream for most women. And it's a beautiful thing because it points to the ultimate reality of us being with Jesus. The church is called the bride of Christ. And here you have the very first miracle occurring at a wedding. And I'll explain more about this. But in the weddings that I have been part of, there's always something that goes wrong. Now, most of the wedding was beautiful and wonderful, and it achieved what we intended, and everybody would have said they were massive successes. But we had these things that didn't quite go right. And I remember in one of the weddings, uh, we apparently invited a lot of people, and because both bride and groom were local, a lot of people came. And since they're both very connected people, we filled up Peace Church. Peace Church was at maximum capacity. People were shoulder to shoulder in every pew. One of the hottest days of the year. And I remember for some reason the air conditioner did not get turned on till like an hour before the wedding. And it was already 90 degrees out and it couldn't keep up. And so everybody was dressed in nice clothes, long suits and ties, and just beads of sweat running down their forehead. It's sort of a definition of the South, huh? Get dressed up in sweat. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that we had a wonderful person who had offered to make the food, and we had a lot of people show up, a lot more than we anticipated, and we actually had to ration the food because there just wasn't enough. And it turned out to be a great event, and it was lovely, but there's always something that goes wrong. And in this story, they have no wine. They've run out of wine. This is kind of embarrassing. This was a big part of the weddings in that day. And Jesus looks at his mom and he says to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour is not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So Jesus is saying to his mom, "Hey, I'm the one who decides when I have my coming out party, not you, Mom." And his mom looks at him and says, "Well, I understand, but I know you can solve this problem." So he looks over at the servant. She looks over at the servants and she says to them, "Listen, if he tells you to do anything, just do what he tells you to do. It may not seem rational." See, Mary knew who Jesus was. She, unlike any other person, knew exactly who Jesus was. And that's the importance of the virgin birth story that we talked about last week. She was a virgin who was pregnant. She gets it. She gets that the normal bounds of this earth cannot contain this man, that he is from heaven and he can do what he wills. So we get to verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Let's stop there. These jars are large clay amphora, and these do hold large amounts of water. And the point of this water was for ritual cleansing. That ritual cleansing ultimately is the refers to baptism. That ultimately becomes part of the Christian experience. And the point of these purifications was to say that in order to enter into the presence of God, and in order to enter into the temple, you had to be cleaned. You had to be cleaned internally. You had to be right with God, and therefore you made sacrifices so that could be proven, so to speak. And then you also had to be clean outside. So clean inside, clean outside. You have to be clean in order to enter the presence of God. And that's what these were for. So Jesus says to the servants at this point, fill the jars with water. Okay, probably took them a while to do this. You got 6 jars. You've got maybe 25 gallons a jar. You're talking about 150 gallons. And they probably had to pull it up from a well. So this probably took a few minutes. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw out some of the water and take it to the master of the feast. Actually, he said, draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. And so they did. And then in verse 9, it says, when the master of the feast tasted the water, had now become wine, and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. Now, this is your wedding planner, right? This is the person who's in charge to make sure everything goes correctly, goes according to plan. And you've met these people, right? They're the people who say you will be here at 11:15, and then at 11:30 we'll have the photographer in, and then at 11:50 the toast will be made, and this is the person who choreographs the whole thing, who takes all these parts and pieces and all these dozens of people and makes that it all come together and makes it happen. This is a compulsive planner. This is a compulsive organizer. And what just happened was that this person got a surprise. Now, this person doesn't like surprises. And so he calls the bridegroom, he calls the groom. He says to him in verse 10, everyone serves the good wine first. And when people have drunk freely, i.e., when they're a little bit drunk, then they serve the poor wine because people won't care. They've already had the good wine. They've already gotten a little bit tipsy. They don't care what the wine tastes like after that. But you have kept the good wine until now. Verse 11, this is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So Jesus chooses to pick a wedding, and he chooses to pick a wedding where they're about to have an embarrassing moment in the wedding, where there is not enough drink. Keep in mind back in that day that wine was an essential part of the diet, and it was one of the sanitary ways which people could drink. Wine was self-preserving because it had alcohol in it. Other types of sweet beverages would ferment on their own or actually grow molds and other things because there was no refrigeration. So wine was an essential part of this feast, and Jesus blessed it. And he not only blessed it, but think about that. You've got at least 150 gallons of wine. I mean, he didn't just pop a couple bottles here. We're talking about hundreds of bottles. This is an equivalent to like an entire wine rack at the store. This is a lot of wine. Why do you suppose Jesus chose to do this? What is the significance of this? And how does this point to heaven? Well, here is a picture of some amphora here. This is a typical amphora, which holds about 10 gallons. Um, and these are found in abundance throughout um, the ancient world. They're also found at the bottom of the ocean, in the middle of ancient shipwrecks. And this is actually showing how this funny shaped vase, if you will, would be used to carry liquids. And in fact, it was the most common transport mechanism for wine itself. What they would do is they would um, put a cork stopper, or put a wax seal in the top of that after they filled it with wine, and then it could stack in a ship's hull, as you're seeing right here. So just to give you some context here, but again, I've given you a few seconds to think about it. Why would he pick converting water from purification jars into wine in huge abundance to be his first miracle? Well, this has to do with the whole concept that he has come to redeem the earth. The purification jars were part of the redemption of his people. And if you continue reading on in John 2, you come across the next section, the very next section, which is Jesus cleansing the temple. He goes up for the feast of the Passover, again, another feast, and he chooses that time to cleanse the temple. He actually overturns the money changers' tables, and he says, this is the Father's house, and it will not be a house of trade. It's a house of prayer. And then he actually goes and he says, I know what's in the heart of man. He talks about that, and then he talks about being born again. He meets Nicodemus immediately after, and he says, you must be born again, Nicodemus. This is one of the rabbis there. And of course, that famous exchange where Nicodemus says, how can a man enter his womb a second time? And of course, he says, do you not know this? And you're a teacher. And then comes the most famous New Testament Bible verse in our generation, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. This is all part of the same story, and it starts with this wedding in Cana. Well, back to this slide. Jesus is eating and drinking on this earth. And that makes sense, right? I mean, he's human. He's fully human. He has to eat and drink. But when he says that heaven is open to you, what we see is that at the very end of the book of John, that Jesus eats with his disciples after his resurrection. In fact, he's the one who creates the charcoal fire, and they have bread and fish, apparently a normal breakfast meal for the Galileans at that time. And Jesus actually provides the fish. He comes to the shore. He yells out to the boat where Peter and John are located, and he says, "Hey, have you caught anything?" They said, "No." And they said, "Just cast your net on that side of the boat." And of course, they come up with this huge haul. So he not only provides the charcoal fire, he provides the fish. He has bread waiting for them on the shore. He eats, they eat. Very interesting, huh? So it's fairly obvious that Jesus intends for eating and drinking to continue after we go to heaven. In other words, the new heaven and the new earth are, in fact, this connected thing, are very physical. Do you believe that? I think a lot of people don't get that we will eat and drink in heaven, that we will have to consume food in order to continue, so to speak. Isn't that bizarre? Have you actually thought that? Because I must admit, was doing this study, I had thought that we would eat and drink because I knew there were feasts there. And in fact, in Matthew 8, verse 11, after Jesus commends the faith of a Roman centurion, which this is in the middle of his ministry, was quite shocking to the Israelites that were following him at the time. He says this, "For I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." He's talking about that they're going to sit down and have a meal with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the beautiful thing is that for most of us at least, he's talking about us, the Gentiles. Many will come from the east and the west. And so we ultimately see this culmination in the wedding feast of the Lamb in Revelation 19. And this is where basically there is a huge table set. This is like the Thanksgiving of Thanksgivings. Everything you can imagine, and all in its full flavor. You know, one of the things that has bothered me about getting older is that my taste buds changed. It seemed like when I was a kid and I would taste things, they had a greater vibrancy to them. Have you noticed that? Those of you who have gotten older here, have you noticed that things just don't taste quite as good as they used to? It's not the food, it's not the flavors, it's us. It's the fact that our taste buds have declined. They've decayed along with some parts of our bodies, and things just don't taste the same that they used to. So one of the things that will happen is that, first of all, our taste buds will be restored. And the wedding feast of the Lamb is a picture of this table set in heaven of wondrous foods for us to eat. And I also believe that being the first miracle, this wedding at Cana, turning water into wine, has symbolic references, of course. He's talking about the blood and the water that was shed on Calvary that was going to be coming up when Jesus was pierced with a sword, and the blood mingled with water, and flowed down his side. And that is what purifies us, is the death of Jesus, his taking our sin upon himself, becoming the curse for us, so that we can enjoy the righteous feasts that he is entitled to. And yet the beauty of his plan is that once he paid for our sin, he was resurrected, and although that was extremely painful for him, he came back from the dead, showed us what it was like, and gave us a vision, a window into the future hall of feasts that we are going to enjoy with him. So if you thought that we won't eat, think again. If you thought that we won't feast, that we won't partay, think again. And if you thought that maybe wine was not going to be part of it, I think you should think again. You know, the Bible says that wine was given to man for his good. And that is why during communions, we celebrate with the juice or the wine. We can now preserve juice, so it's not as critical that we have fermented wine. But technically, fermented wine was what Jesus served to his disciples at the Passover meal. It was the only thing that would have, even if they had tried to keep it as grape juice, it just wouldn't have lasted it would have self-fermented within a couple days, because there's, again, no refrigeration. But today we have methods to do that. We have seals that are very good, and we can pasteurize things in containers, plastic and metal containers, etc. Anyway, the communion of us with God is depicted by wine and bread. And you see these two events, and that indicates that we are going to have a taste now of what it's like in heaven, and it will project forward to the fact that we will someday sit with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and enjoy a meal, and it will be fabulous. absolutely fabulous. So let us pray. God, you have given us great and beautiful examples of what heaven will be like here. Lord, it's like a fabulous feast. It's like a fabulous wedding. It's like some of our fellowship dinners where there's so many different kinds of food brought and people are in a joyous mood. It's like having Pete Westerbeek's grilled pig, pulled pig. Oh Lord, I love that pulled pork. That's for sure. And Father, you've given us this example of beauty and taste and sensory overload to tell us that this is going to be really incredible, much more incredible, because the one who makes it possible will be with us. The the Father and the Son, those who love us the most, more than we even love ourselves in a lot of cases, will be there. And you are going to help us not only enjoy the physical reality of the beauty of the feast and the wondrous fellowships and the great stories, but you will make us feel loved and wanted and encouraged and safe and glad that we are your children. We thank you that you love us, Lord. We thank you that you have loved us through Jesus. We thank you especially for him. And we ask, and I ask personally, that you would bless this message to all those who have heard or heard today. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.